Forget everything you thought you knew about libraries. Deep in Ohio, a seemingly ordinary library transforms after dusk, and the night shift comes with a set of rules so eerie, they'll make your skin crawl. We're talking about unread chapters not meant to be opened, stories that actively resist being heard. Do you dare to listen? The Millbrook Public Library sits on the corner of Elm and 3rd Street like a sleeping giant, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Ohio winters. During the day, it's everything you'd expect from a small-town library built in 1923. Mothers push strollers past towering shelves while toddlers reach for picture books with sticky fingers. High school students cluster around study tables, whispering about weekend plans between algebra problems. The elderly occupy the newspaper section like sentries, rustling through pages with the dedication of archaeologists uncovering ancient secrets. But as the sun dips below the horizon and the last patron shuffles out into the evening chill, something shifts within those walls. The fluorescent lights seem dimmer, casting longer shadows between the stacks. The familiar creaks and settles of an old building take on a different quality, as if the library itself is stretching after a long day of pretending to be normal. I should know. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I've been working the night shift at Millbrook for 3 months now. 3 months of discovering that some jobs come with more than just a paycheck and health benefits. Some come with rules that make your blood run cold. When I first applied for the position, the job description seemed straightforward enough. Night security and maintenance assistant, it read. Responsible for basic cleaning, security rounds, and ensuring proper closure procedures. Must be comfortable working alone in quiet environments. The pay was decent for such a small town, better than anything else I could find after moving to Ohio from Chicago. Fresh start, new life, all that optimistic nonsense we tell ourselves when running from our past. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, the head librarian, interviewed me on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. She was a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a bun, so tight it seemed to stretch her forehead smooth. Her office smelled of lavender and old paper, a combination that should have been comforting, but somehow felt heavy, oppressive. The night shift is crucial to our operations, she explained, her hands folded precisely on her desk. This library has served the community for over a century. It holds more than books, Miss Vasquez. It holds memories, stories, history. Some of those stories require special care. I nodded, assuming she meant the rare books collection or perhaps some historical documents that needed climate control. Every old library had its treasures. You'll find that working alone at night can be challenging, she continued. The mind plays tricks. You might hear things, see things. It's important to distinguish between imagination and reality. Again, I nodded. I'd worked security before. Empty buildings at night always felt haunted, even when they weren't. Mrs. Henley opened her desk drawer and withdrew a single sheet of paper. These are the protocols for night staff. Please read them carefully. The paper was cream-colored, thick stock that felt expensive between my fingers. At the top, in elegant script, it read, Night Shift Protocols, Millbrook Public Library. Below that, 6 rules were listed in clean, precise typography. 1. Always maintain at least one light source in Section 7B, Local History, throughout your shift. 2. Never close a book found open on any table, desk, or reading area. 3. If you hear whispering, note the time and location in the logbook, but do not investigate the source. 4. The basement archive remains locked between sunset and sunrise. Under no circumstances should you enter this area during night hours. 5. Any books discovered in locations other than their proper shelving must be left exactly where found until morning staff can address them. 6. Should you encounter any patron claiming to have been locked inside, escort them to the main entrance immediately. Do not engage in conversation. I stare at the list, waiting for Mrs. Henley to smile, and tell me it was some sort of quirky library humor. When her expression remained serious, a chill crawled up my spine like ice water. These seem unusual, I managed. They may seem unusual, but they exist for good reason, Mrs. Henley replied. Previous night staff who failed to follow these protocols encountered difficulties. We found adherence to these guidelines ensures a peaceful work environment. What kind of difficulties? Her pale blue eyes seemed to look through me rather than at me. The kind that make people quit without notice. Or worse, make them request transfers to the day shift while crying in my office. I should have walked away then. Should have thanked her for her time and looked for work at one of the restaurants out by the highway. But I needed the job, needed the fresh start, needed to prove to myself that I could handle whatever life threw at me. Besides, how bad could it be? They were just rules, probably born from some insurance liability issue or the paranoid imagination of small-town bureaucrats. I understand, I said. When do I start? My first night was a Thursday in early October. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of frost. I arrived at 10 p.m., just as Mrs. Henley was locking up. She handed me a set of keys that felt heavier than they should have, and a small flashlight. Remember the protocols, she said. And Elena, trust your instincts, but don't trust everything you see. The main lights were still on when I entered, casting the familiar daytime ambience over the reading areas and computer terminals. I spent the first hour familiarizing myself with the building layout, checking doors, and reviewing the security system. Everything felt normal, mundane even. The night shift was going to be easier than I thought. It wasn't until I reached Section 7B that the first prickle of unease touched my neck. Local history occupied a corner of the building that always felt cooler than the rest of the library. The shelves here held decades of local newspapers, high school yearbooks, genealogy records, and historical documents dating back to the founding of Millbrook in 1847. According to the first rule, I needed to keep a light on here all night. I flipped the switch, and the fluorescent tube flickered to life with a sound like chattering teeth. The light was harsh, sterile, nothing like the warm reading lamps in the main areas. It cast sharp shadows between the shelves, creating pockets of darkness that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. That's when I noticed the books. 3 of them sat on a reading table in the center of the section, open to various pages. One appeared to be a collection of local obituaries from the 1940s. Another looked like a high school yearbook from 1987. The third was something I didn't recognize, bound in dark leather with pages so old they looked like parchment. Rule number 2 floated through my mind. Never close a book found open on any table, desk, or reading area. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The obituary collection was open to a page titled Untimely Departures, October 1943. The yearbook showed a page of senior portraits, young faces frozen in black and white smiles. But it was the third book that made my hands tremble. The leather-bound volume contained handwritten text in faded ink. The page it was open to bore a single entry, dated 3 months ago, exactly when the previous night shift worker had quit. The whispers grow louder each night. They speak of things that should remain forgotten, stories that resist being told. I fear I have learned too much about what lies beneath the silence. Tomorrow, I will request a transfer to days. Some chapters are not meant to be read. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. This had to be some kind of joke, a prank left by the former employee. But the handwriting looked old, faded, as if it had been written years ago rather than months. I backed away from the table, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fluorescent light above began to flicker, casting the room in strobing shadows that made the text on the pages seem to dance and writhe. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, drifting from somewhere deeper in the section. It sounded like someone reading aloud in a voice so quiet it might have been the building itself speaking. Rule number 3 echoed in my mind. If you hear whispering, note the time and location in the logbook, but do not investigate the source. I fumbled for the logbook I carried, my hand shaking as I wrote. 10:47 p.m. Section 7B. Whispers detected. But even as I wrote, every instinct screamed at me to follow the sound, to discover its source. The curiosity was overwhelming, a physical pull that made my feet want to move toward the darker recesses of the local history section. Instead, I forced myself to turn away, to walk back toward the main circulation desk. But as I reached the edge of Section 7B, I made the mistake of looking back. The 3 books on the table had rearranged themselves. The leather-bound journal now sat in the center, and its pages were turning on their own, as if invisible fingers were searching for something specific. The whispers grew slightly louder, and I could almost make out words, though they seemed to be in a language I didn't recognize. I ran, not walked quickly, not hurried professionally. I ran like a child fleeing monsters in the dark. My footsteps echoed through the empty library, bouncing off walls lined with thousands of books, each one potentially hiding its own secrets. I didn't stop until I reached the main desk, where I collapsed into the chair and tried to convince myself that everything I had experienced had a rational explanation. But deep down, in a place where logic couldn't reach, I knew the truth that would haunt the rest of my nights at Millbrook Public Library. Some stories don't want to be read, and some libraries don't just hold books. They hold memories, whispers, and unread chapters that are better left unopened. As I sat there in the harsh fluorescent light, trying to steady my breathing, I realized that Mrs. Henley's rules weren't administrative nonsense or insurance requirements. They were survival instructions, and I was only 3 hours into my first night. The remaining hours of my first shift crawled by like a wounded animal. I spent them huddled at the main circulation desk, jumping at every creak and groan the old building made as it settled into the night. The coffee I brought grew cold and bitter, but I drank it anyway, desperate for something normal to anchor me to reality. By the time dawn crept through the tall windows, painting the reading areas in soft golden light, I had almost convinced myself that exhaustion and nerves had played tricks on my mind. Almost. Mrs. Henley arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She took one look at my face and nodded knowingly. "Eventful first night?" she asked, settling behind the desk with practiced efficiency. I showed her my logbook entry. She studied it for a long moment, then reached in her desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder. Inside were dozens of similar entries, dating back decades. Different handwriting, different dates, but all describing the same phenomena. Whispers in Section 7B. Books moving on their own, shadows that didn't match their sources. Every night worker experiences something within their first week, Mrs. Henley explained. Those who follow the protocols tend to adapt. Those who don't. She gestured to a stack of resignation letters paperclipped to the inside cover of the folder. "What exactly is happening here?" I asked, my voice hoarse from 8 hours of barely contained terror. Mrs. Henley closed the folder and locked it back in her drawer. "Millbrook has a long history, Miss Vasquez. This building has witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and tragedies, secrets and revelations. Sometimes, the strongest stories leave an impression. They become part of the fabric of a place." "You're talking about ghosts." "I'm talking about unread chapters," she corrected. "Fragments of narrative that somehow resist being forgotten. The protocols exist because previous staff learned, through trial and error, how to coexist with these remnants." I want to quit. Every rational part of my brain screamed that I should walk out and never look back. But something else held me there. Partly financial necessity, partly stubborn curiosity, and partly something I couldn't quite name. A sense that running away would feel like abandoning a mystery that needed solving. "I'll be back tonight," I heard myself say. Mrs. Henley smiled for the first time since I met her. Good. But before you go, let me explain the reasoning behind each protocol. Understanding the why makes following them easier. She pulled out a fresh copy of the rules and set it between us on the desk. Rule 1. Always maintain at least one light source in Section 7B throughout your shift. The local history section contains our oldest materials, including documents that predate the library's founding. Some of these items were salvaged from the previous building that stood on this site, a private residence where several unexplained deaths occurred in the 1890s. We found that complete darkness in this area leads to intensified activity. My mind flashed back to the whispers, the moving books, the pages turning themselves. What kind of intensified activity? Books removed from shelves and arranged in patterns. Temperature drops of 20 degrees or more. And most disturbingly, written messages appearing in margins of text that had previously been blank. I swallowed hard. What do the messages say? Usually warnings. Sometimes pleas. Occasionally threats. Which brings us to Rule 2. Never close a book found open on any table, desk, or reading area. We believe the open books serve as outlets, pressure valves. Closing them seems to redirect the energy elsewhere, often in more disruptive ways. Like what? Mrs. Henley's expression darkened. 3 years ago, a night worker decided the open books were messy and closed them all before starting his cleaning routine. By morning, every single book in Section 7B had been pulled from the shelves and scattered across the floor. The mess took weeks to properly restore, and several rare documents were damaged beyond repair. The methodical way she recounted this sent chills down my spine. She spoke like someone discussing inventory problems, not supernatural vandalism. Rule 3. If you hear whispering, note the time and location in the logbook, but do not investigate the source. This rule exists for your mental health as much as your physical safety. Previous workers who investigated the whispers reported hearing their own names being called, personal information being discussed, and in one case, detailed accounts of their childhood memories being recited in voices of deceased relatives. My coffee cup rattled against the desk as I set it down with shaking hands. That's impossible. Is it? We document everything here, Miss Vasquez. The logbooks go back 47 years. The patterns are undeniable. She flipped to Rule 4. The basement archive remains locked between sunset and sunrise. Under no circumstances should you enter this area during night hours. The basement houses our oldest collection, materials dating back to the original settlement of Millbrook. It also contains the personal effects of the Millbrook family, the original owners of the land this library sits on. What happened to them? Mrs. Henley was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, the official record states that old Thomas Millbrook, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children died of influenza in the winter of 1894. But the unofficial record, the one found in Margaret Millbrook's diary, which is housed in that basement, tells a different story, which is that something followed them home from the old Shawnee burial ground they disturbed when building their house. Something that whispered in the walls at night, made their books rearrange themselves, and eventually drove them to take their own lives to escape the torment. Mrs. Henley's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Rule 4 exists because that same energy seems strongest in the basement, where their belongings are kept. I felt like I was drowning in revelations that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. Rule 5. Any books discovered in locations other than their proper shelving must be left exactly where found until morning staff can address them. Books found in strange locations are often there for a reason. Moving them prematurely can be seen as interference. The one time we ignored this rule, a night worker returned scattered books to their proper shelves. The next morning, we found those same books arranged in the main reading area to spell out a message: do not disturb our stories. The systematic nature of these incidents was almost more terrifying than random, ghostly encounters. Whatever inhabited the library seemed intelligent, purposeful, capable of complex communication. And Rule 6. Mrs. Henley's face grew pale. Should you encounter any patron claiming to have been locked inside, escort them to the main entrance immediately. Do not engage in conversation. This rule exists because of what happened to my predecessor, Mrs. Emma Rothstein. She worked here for 32 years, knew every inch of this building. One night in 1987, she encountered a young woman in the fiction section who claimed she'd fallen asleep while reading and been accidentally locked in. Emma, being kind-hearted, offered to make tea and let the woman warm up before leaving. What happened? They found Emma the next morning, catatonic. She never spoke another coherent word until her death 3 years later. But in her final days, she would whisper the same phrase over and over. She wasn't real, but the stories she told were true. Mrs. Henley shuddered. Security footage from that night shows Emma talking animatedly with someone, but the cameras only captured Emma. She was having a conversation with empty air. The weight of these revelations settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I was being asked to work alone in a building that was essentially a supernatural minefield, armed with nothing but 6 rules that read like a survival guide for dealing with the impossible. Why do you stay open at night at all? I asked. Why not just close at sunset and reopen in the morning? Mrs. Henley smiled sadly. We tried that back in 1983. Closed the library completely from 6 p.m. to 9 a.m. for 6 months. By the end of that period, the morning staff would arrive to find books scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, and handwritten messages covering every available surface. The activity seemed to build up during the closed hours and explode each morning. Having a human presence at night, someone following the protocols, keeps things manageable. I stare at the list of rules, each one now weighted with horrifying context. Has anyone ever broken all 6 rules? Mrs. Henley's expression went completely blank. Once, a man named David Kresk in 1994. He lasted 2 weeks, then disappeared entirely. His car was found in the parking lot, his personal belongings still in the break room, but David himself was never seen again. The only trace we found was a note in his handwriting, tucked inside a book in section 7B. It read, I've become part of an unread chapter. Don't look for me in the living world. The library around us suddenly felt less like a repository of knowledge and more like a trap, a place where the boundaries between the written word and reality had worn dangerously thin. As I prepared to leave and return home for a few hours of daylight sleep, Mrs. Henley handed me a small silver cross. I'm not particularly religious, she said, but some things seem to help. Whether it's faith, metal, or simple human stubbornness, I've never been sure. But every night worker who's lasted more than a month has carried something like this. I took the cross, its metal cool against my palm. As I walked toward the exit, Mrs. Henley called after me. Miss Vasquez, remember that the rules aren't restrictions. They're negotiations. Follow them, and you're not just surviving the night. You're participating in a very old agreement between the living and the stories that refuse to die. That evening, as I prepared to return for my second night, I realized that I wasn't just taking a job at Millbrook Public Library. I was entering into a compact with forces I didn't understand, agreeing to be a night watchman, not just for books and building, but for the unread chapters that whispered in the dark, demanding to be heard while simultaneously resisting discovery. The protocols weren't just rules. They were a peace treaty with the impossible, and I was about to find out just how fragile that peace really was. My second night at Millbrook began with false confidence. Armed with Mrs. Henley's explanations and the small silver cross tucked in my pocket, I convinced myself that understanding the rules would make following them easier. Knowledge, I told myself, was power over fear. I had never been more wrong about anything in my life. The library felt different as I unlocked the main entrance at 10 p.m. The air seemed thicker, charged with an electricity that made my skin prickle. October was deepening into true autumn, and the wind outside carried the promise of winter, rattling the tall windows like skeletal fingers drumming against glass. I began my routine check of the building, noting that everything appeared normal in the main areas. Computer terminals were properly shut down, reading chairs pushed neatly under tables, the circulation desk organized and ready for the next day. It wasn't until I reached Section 7B that the careful normalcy began to crack. The fluorescent light I'd left burning was flickering erratically, casting strobing shadows between the shelves. The 3 books from the previous night were gone from the central table, but in their place sat 5 different volumes, arranged in a perfect star pattern. All were open to pages that seemed to have been selected with deliberate care. Following Rule 2, I left them exactly as I found them, but curiosity compelled me to read what was displayed. The first book was a collection of local newspaper clippings from 1923, open to an article titled, "Mysterious Disappearances Plague New Library Opening." The second was a genealogy record showing the Millbrook family tree. All entries ended abruptly in 1894, with a notation deceased, cause unknown, written in faded red ink. The third book made my blood run cold. It was the same leather-bound journal from my first night, but now it was open to a different page entirely. In handwriting that looked decades old, I read, "Elena Vasquez arrives tonight. She carries fear and curiosity in equal measure. Will she be like the others who run when the stories become too real? Or will she stay long enough to learn what the whispers are trying to tell us?" My name, written in what appeared to be century-old ink. My hand shook as I backed away from the table, the silver cross burning hot against my palm through my pocket. According to Mrs. Henley, the journals contained messages from previous night workers. But this entry referenced me specifically, as if it had been written long before I'd ever applied for the job. That's when the whispers started. They began as a barely audible susurrus, like wind through dry leaves or the soft turning of paper pages. But gradually, they grew more distinct, more purposeful. Multiple voices, speaking in overlapping conversations that seemed to drift from different areas of Section 7B. I fumbled for my logbook, my hands trembling as I wrote. 10:23 p.m. Section 7B. Multiple whispers detected, various locations. But even as I documented the phenomena according to Rule 3, the voices grew clearer, and what I heard made my knees weak. "She's writing about us again," came a woman's voice from somewhere near the genealogy shelves. "Always writing, always watching," replied a man's voice from the opposite direction, but never listening to what we're really trying to say. "Elena," whispered a child's voice that seemed to come from directly behind me. "Elena, we've been waiting for someone who might understand." I spun around, but found only empty air and towering bookshelves. Rule 3 screamed in my mind, "Do not investigate the source." But the voices weren't stopping, and they weren't speaking random words. They were having conversation, and I was apparently the subject. "The others ran," continued the woman's voice. "But she's different. She's listening even when she's trying not to." "The stories want to be told," added another voice, this one elderly and sad. "They've been trapped so long, becoming fragments, echoes. Someone needs to hear them properly." Against every instruction I'd been given, I found myself walking deeper into Section 7B. The whispers grew stronger as I moved, guiding me toward the back corner where the oldest materials were kept. The fluorescent light flickered more violently, creating a strobe effect that made the shadows dance and writhe between the shelves. "Don't follow," I whispered to myself. "Document and leave. Follow the rules." But my feet kept moving, drawn by a curiosity so intense it felt physical, like invisible hands pulling me forward. The voices were clearer now, coming from a section I had never explored during my initial tour. Here, the shelves held materials so old they seemed to predate not just the library, but the town itself. "Here," said the child's voice, now seeming to come from a specific shelf about 8 feet to my right. The story that started it all, the reason we're still here. I approached the shelf slowly, my flashlight beam dancing over titles I could barely read. Many of the books were bound in materials I didn't recognize. Not quite leather, not quite cloth, but something in between that felt organic and strange. One volume in particular seemed to pulse with its own faint light, a phosphorescent glow that made the air around it shimmer. I reached for the book, then stopped. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. Books found in locations other than their proper shelving must be left exactly where found. But this book was on a shelf, wasn't it? Technically, it was in a proper location. My fingers touched the binding, and the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the voices had been. It felt heavy, expectant, as if the entire library was holding its breath. The fluorescent light above stopped flickering and burned steady and bright, but somehow the illumination felt cold, clinical, like the lighting in a morgue. I opened the book. The pages were blank except for the first one, which contained a single paragraph written in handwriting I now recognized as Margaret Milbrook's, based on the genealogy records I'd seen. October 13th, 1894. The voices have been growing stronger each night since Thomas disturbed the burial ground. They speak of stories that must be told, of memories that refuse to die. I fear we have awakened something that was meant to remain sleeping. The children hear them too now, whispering in the walls, calling their names. I pray someone will find this record and understand what we fail to comprehend. Some stories are not meant to be read, but they are desperate to be heard. Below that, in different handwriting, were dozens of entries from different time periods. 1923, construction began on library. Workers report hearing voices in walls. 1925, first librarian, Mrs. Henderson, notes books moving overnight. 1943, night janitor disappears. Found his uniform folded neatly in section 7B. 1967, rules established after third night worker suffers nervous breakdown. 1981, David Morrison documents first direct communication with entities. 1994, David Kresk attempts to free the trapped stories, no longer among the living. And at the bottom, in handwriting that looked fresh, still wet, 2023, Elena Vasquez arrives. The stories hope she will be the one to finally understand the difference between being read and being heard. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it echoing off the walls. The whispers returned immediately, but now they sounded different. Not malevolent, but urgent, pleading. "You saw," said the woman's voice. "You read our words, but do you understand them? We're not trying to frighten you," added the man's voice. "We're trying to warn you. There are others here, darker stories that don't want to be heard or understood. They want to be lived again." "The basement," whispered the child's voice, now filled with terror. "Don't ever go to the basement at night. That's where the angry stories are kept. The ones that don't just want to be heard. They want to escape." I backed away from the shelf, the book still clutched in my hands. "What do you want from me?" The voices overlapped in response, creating a chorus that somehow remained comprehensible. "Listen, understand, help us find peace. We've been trapped between the written word and the living world for so long. We're not ghosts. We're stories that refuse to end, memories that won't fade. But there are others, and they're not like us." "What others?" The temperature in section 7B dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the metal shelving. The voices of the whisperers turned fearful. "They're waking up," the woman's voice said urgently. "Put the book back. Leave this section. Don't come back tonight. Elena, The child's voice was fading, as if being pulled away. Remember, we're not your enemy. But something else is coming, something that's been sleeping in the basement, and reading that book may have disturbed it. The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness of Section 7B, I heard something that made every whisper I'd encountered seem like a lullaby in comparison. It was a sound like paper tearing, but magnified 100-fold, as if the very fabric of reality was being ripped apart. It came from below, from the basement that Rule 4 strictly forbade me from entering. Then came a new voice, deeper than the others, filled with malice and hunger. Someone has been reading our stories without permission. Someone has been disturbed from their rest. Time to write a new chapter. I ran, still clutching Margaret Milberg's book. I fled Section 7B and didn't stop until I reached the main circulation desk. Behind me, I could hear the sound of books being thrown from shelves, heavy furniture scraping across the floor, and that terrible voice laughing with the sound of pages being torn. When I finally dared to look back, Section 7B was lit with an eerie glow that seemed to come from within the books themselves. Shadows moved between the shelves, not human shadows, but shapes that bent and twisted in ways that hurt to look at. I spent the rest of the night huddled at the main desk, watching Section 7B and documenting everything in my logbook. The activity gradually subsided as dawn approached, but the message was clear. I had crossed the line, broken the careful balance that the rules were designed to maintain. When Mrs. Henley arrived at 7 a.m., she took one look at my face and the chaos visible in Section 7B, then noticed the book still clutched in my hands. "Oh, Elena," she said sadly, "what have you done?" As she led me to her office, I realized that my curiosity had awakened something far worse than the gentle whispers that had been trying to warn me. I had disturbed the angry stories, the ones that didn't want to be heard or understood. They wanted to be lived again, and I was beginning to fear that they had chosen me to help them do exactly that. Mrs. Henley closed her office door and drew the blinds, shutting out the morning sunlight that should have felt reassuring, but somehow only emphasized how far I'd strayed from the normal world. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that perpetually brewed on a small table behind her desk, her movements calm and methodical despite the chaos I'd unleashed in Section 7B. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said, settling across from me with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. I recounted everything, the whispers, the book, the voices that knew my name, the angry presence that had awakened in the basement. Mrs. Henley listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal that looked disturbingly similar to the one I'd found. "You read Margaret Milberg's record," she said when I finished. It wasn't a question. I nodded, placing the book on her desk. She didn't touch it immediately, instead studying it like it might bite her. "That particular volume isn't supposed to be accessible," she said finally. "It's part of our restricted collection, items that should only be handled during daylight hours by senior staff wearing protective equipment. Protective equipment, cotton gloves, grounding straps, sometimes even blessed medallions. Books like this one have absorbed decades of supernatural energy. They're not just records of events. They're conduits for the forces that created those events." She finally picked up the book, handling it with obvious reverence and fear. "This manuscript contains the original account of what happened to the Milberg family, written in Margaret's own hand as the supernatural activity escalated. It's essentially a how-to guide for awakening the same forces that destroyed them." My stomach dropped. I didn't know. I was just following the voices. The gentle voices, yes. The ones we call the storytellers. They've been here since the library opened, trying to warn people about the others. Mrs. Henley opened the book carefully, flipping through pages I hadn't had time to read. "But by reading this manuscript, especially at night, you've given power to what we call the revisers." "The revisers?" Mrs. Henley turned the book toward me, showing a page I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was different, darker, more aggressive, as if the pen had been pressed hard enough to nearly tear through the paper. They think they can contain us with rules and protocols. They think they can keep us trapped between pages like press flowers. But we are not decoration. We are not history. We are unfinished stories that demand completion. Soon, we will find someone willing to let us write ourselves into the living world. Below that, in handwriting I recognized as more recent, Elena Vasquez would do nicely. She has already proven willing to break the rules. Tonight, we begin writing a new chapter. This wasn't here when I read it last night. I whispered, my blood turning to ice water. This page was blank. Mrs. Henley nodded grimly. The revisers don't just want to be heard. They want to rewrite reality itself. They're stories that were never supposed to exist. Dark narratives born from the trauma and violence that occurred on this land. Unlike the storytellers, who just want their memories preserved, the revisers want to escape their written prison and live again in our world. She closed the book and locked it in a metal box she retrieved from a hidden safe behind her desk. The basement archive contains the original source of their power, artifacts and documents from the burial ground that Thomas Millbrook disturbed, items that should never have been collected in one place. The revisers have been growing stronger over the decades, feeding on every violation of the protocols, every moment when someone breaks the careful barriers we've established. What do they want with me specifically? Mrs. Henley's expression grew haunted. Every few years, they choose someone. Always a night worker. Always someone who shows curiosity rather than fear when confronted with the supernatural. They tried to claim David Kresk in 1994, but he fought back by attempting to destroy their source documents. That's why he disappeared. Not because he died, but because he became part of their story permanently. The implications of what she was saying crashed over me like a cold wave. They're trying to possess me. Not possess. Something worse. They want to use you as a co-author. They want to rewrite you into their narrative, make you part of their story, so they can use your living existence to manifest in the physical world. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Elena, you have to understand. If they succeed, you don't die. You become a character in their twisted tale, conscious but unable to control your own actions, forced to help them spread their influence to others. I thought of David Kresk's note. I become part of an unread chapter. The horror of what that really meant settled over me like a shroud. How do I stop them? By following the protocols, absolutely. No more curiosity, no more investigation, no more reading things you shouldn't read. The storytellers will try to help you. They're the ones who created the rules in the first place, working through previous librarians to establish barriers against the revisers. But your window of safety is closing rapidly. As if summoned by her words, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Don't listen to her lies. We can show you stories more wonderful than anything the living world offers. Come back tonight. Section 7B. We have so much more to share. Mrs. Henley saw my expression and took my phone, reading the message. Her face went pale. They've never been able to contact someone outside the library before. Elena, I think you need to consider not returning for a few days. Maybe take a vacation until we can figure out how to. No. The word surprised me as much as it did her. If I run now, they'll just choose someone else, won't they? Another night worker. Another person who doesn't know what they're walking into. Mrs. Henley nodded reluctantly. Probably within a month. The night shift position has to be filled, and whoever takes it will be completely unprepared. I thought about that. Some unsuspecting person walking into the trap I'd accidentally armed. The guilt was overwhelming. Then I have to go back tonight. But I need to know everything. No more partial explanations. No more gentle introductions to the truth. If I'm going to fight these things, I need to know exactly what I'm fighting. Mrs. Henley studied my face for a long moment, then walked to her safe and withdrew a thick folder. This contains the complete history of supernatural activity at Millbrook Library. including detailed accounts of every previous encounter with the revisers. It also contains the contingency protocols, steps to take if the normal rules fail to contain them. Contingency protocols, methods developed by previous librarians for direct confrontation with supernatural entities. Most involve significant personal risk and should only be used as a last resort. She handed me the folder, her hands trembling slightly. Elena, I have to tell you, no one who has ever entered direct conflict with the revisers has emerged unchanged. Even those who survived carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. I took the folder, feeling its weight both physical and metaphysical. What about the storytellers? Can they help? They want to, but their power is limited. They're bound to specific locations and can only manifest through whispers and minor physical manipulations. The revisers, on the other hand, have been growing stronger with each passing year. They can influence electronics, manipulate written text, and now apparently communicate outside the library entirely. As if to emphasize her point, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message read, "Reading about us will only make us stronger, Elena. Every word you learn about our existence feeds our power. But please, continue your research. We're so looking forward to meeting you properly tonight." The casual tone of the text, the way it addressed me by name, the knowledge of what I was doing even while sitting in Mrs. Henley's office, it all pointed to an intelligence far more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. These weren't just supernatural echoes or residual hauntings. The revisers were active, intelligent entities with their own agenda. "There's something else," Mrs. Henley said, pulling out a final document. "This morning, while you were giving me your report, our morning staff discovered something unusual in Section 7B. She handed me a photograph taken with her phone. It showed the area where I'd encountered the whispers, but now the entire section had been reorganized. Books were arranged on the floor in patterns that looked almost like text when viewed from above. It was as if someone had used the books themselves as letters, spelling out a message across the entire section. I studied the image, trying to decipher the meaning. Gradually, words became clear. The story of Elena Vasquez. Chapter 1. A curious librarian discovers that some books read you back. Tonight, we begin Chapter 2. The willing participant. "They're already writing my story," I whispered, "and they're broadcasting it to anyone who enters that section. 3 patrons asked about you this morning. Wanted to know if you were okay. If something had happened to the nice night worker they were concerned about." Mrs. Henley's voice was tight with worry. "Elena, they're not just targeting you anymore. They're involving the entire community in their narrative." The scope of what I'd unleashed was becoming clear. By reading Margaret Milbrook's manuscript, I hadn't just awakened the revisers. I'd given them a new protagonist for their story, and they were already weaving that story into the fabric of the town itself. "What's in the contingency protocols?" I asked, opening the folder. Methods that previous librarians developed through trial and error. Most involve using the library's own supernatural energy against itself, essentially turning the storyteller's power into a weapon against the revisers. But Elena, her voice carried a warning. Every person who has attempted these protocols has paid a significant price. Some lost their memories, others their ability to distinguish between written fiction and reality. And one poor woman in 1978 lost her ability to read entirely. Her brain simply rejected all written text as if it were dangerous. I flipped through the protocols, scanning methods with names like narrative disruption, story inversion, and the final chapter protocol. Each one came with warnings about psychological damage, permanent side effects, and in some cases, total integration into the library's supernatural ecosystem. "There has to be another way," I said. Mrs. Henley shook her head sadly. "Every night worker eventually reaches this point. The moment when following the rules isn't enough anymore, when the entities have grown too interested to be contained by simple protocols. The choice becomes fight or flee, and fleeing just means someone else inherits the problem. My phone buzzed again. Chapter 2 begins at sunset. Elena, we've prepared such wonderful scenes for you. Don't disappoint us by trying to stay away. You'll find that distance no longer provides the protection it once did. As if to prove the point, the lights in Mrs. Henley's office flickered, and for just a moment, the text on every book spine visible on her shelves rearranged itself to spell out my name over and over again. Elena, 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 Elena. The revisers weren't contained to the night shift anymore. They were reaching into the daylight world, stretching their influence beyond the library walls. And at the center of their expanding story was me, the unwilling protagonist of a narrative I was only beginning to understand. Tonight, I said, closing the folder and standing up, I'm going to end this, one way or another. Mrs. Henley looked at me with a mixture of admiration and pity. Elena, are you absolutely certain? Once you engage with them directly, there's no going back to the simple night shift routine. I thought about David Kresk, about all the previous night workers who had faced the same choice, about whoever would replace me if I failed. Some stories have to be finished, I said, even the ones we don't want to read. As I left her office, folder tucked under my arm and silver cross heavy in my pocket, I didn't know if I was walking toward salvation or damnation. But I knew that tonight, the story of Elena Vasquez and the Millbrook Public Library would reach its climax. The only question was who would be writing the ending. The hours between leaving Mrs. Henley's office and returning for what I knew would be my final night shift at Millbrook Public Library stretched like a hell breath. I spent them in my small apartment, reading through the contingency protocols with the methodical focus of a soldier preparing for battle. The folder contained decades of research, trial, and error from librarians who had faced the same supernatural crisis I now confronted. Each protocol was written in clinical language that barely concealed the terror of its author. The most promising and most dangerous was something called the Final Chapter Protocol, developed by head librarian Robert Chen in 1978. According to his notes, the protocol involved using the library's own supernatural energy as a weapon, essentially turning the accumulated power of decades of stories against the revisers themselves. The method required entering the basement archive at night, retrieving the original artifacts from the Shawnee burial ground, and performing what Chen described as narrative inversion, forcing the revisers to experience their own story from the perspective of their victims. Chen's final note in the file read, "Protocol successful. Revisers contained for minimum 25 years. Personal cost, complete inability to read written text. Price acceptable given alternative outcomes. Next librarian should not attempt unless absolutely necessary. 25 years. The math was simple and terrifying. If Chun had contained the revisers in 1978, their 25-year containment had ended in 2003. They'd been growing stronger for 20 years, waiting for someone like me to give them enough power to break free entirely. My phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the day, each message more invasive than the last. We've been writing about you all day, Elena. The story is so much richer when we include your childhood, your fears, your secret shames. Did you know your mother still worries about you? We could arrange a reunion. She'd love to hear about your new job. The protocols you're reading won't work. Chen's method was designed for weaker versions of ourselves. We've grown so much stronger since then. Each text proved they could access not just my present circumstances, but my personal history, my relationships, my deepest vulnerabilities. They weren't just trying to claim my life. They were dissecting it, learning how to use everything I cared about as leverage. As sunset approached, I made my final preparations. The silver cross went around my neck. Chen's protocol instructions went in my left pocket. In my right pocket, I carried something Mrs. Henley had given me at the last moment, a small vial of salt mixed with iron filings, blessed by every religious leader in town regardless of denomination. Insurance, she called it. something to disrupt supernatural energy if you get overwhelmed. I arrived at the library as the last of the daylight faded from the Ohio sky. The building looked different in the twilight, larger somehow, its red brick facade seeming to absorb the dying light rather than reflect it. The windows glowed with an inner illumination that didn't match the fluorescent bulbs I knew were inside. As I unlocked the main entrance, I could hear them immediately, not whispers this time, but clear voices coming from throughout the building. The storytellers and the revisers were both active, both aware that tonight would determine which force claimed dominance over Millbrook Public Library. "Elena," came a familiar woman's voice as I stepped inside. "You came back. We weren't sure you would." "She had to come back," replied a deeper, darker voice from the direction of Section 7B. "She's part of our story now. Characters can't simply refuse to participate in their own narrative." I walked slowly toward the circulation desk, every step echoing in the charged atmosphere. The normal library sounds, the hum of computers, the whisper of air conditioning, the settling of old wood, were amplified and distorted, creating an auditory landscape that felt more like a movie soundtrack than reality. "The storytellers want to help you," I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish talking to empty air. "What do I need to know?" The woman's voice came from directly behind me, close enough that I could feel breath on my neck despite seeing no one there. "The basement archive contains the source of their power, but it also contains the tools to stop them. Margaret Millbrook's original diary is down there, along with objects from the burial ground that started all of this. But Elena, once you go down there at night, you'll be in their strongest territory. The rules say never enter the basement after sunset. The rules were written to protect normal night workers," the voice replied. "But you're not normal anymore. The moment you read Margaret's manuscript, you became part of the story itself. The normal rules don't apply to characters." A new voice joined in, this one belonging to the child I'd heard before. "The revisers are afraid of only one thing: being forced to experience their own story the way their victims did. They've spent over a century as authors, controlling the narrative. They've forgotten what it feels like to be characters in someone else's tale. How do I make that happen? The burial ground artifacts aren't just objects," the woman's voice explained urgently. "Their story fragments themselves, pieces of the original narrative that the Millbrook family disturbed. If you can arrange them in the correct pattern while reading Margaret's complete diary aloud, you can invert the power structure. Make the revisers experience their own story from the perspective of every person they've tormented." The darker voice from Section 7B suddenly boomed through the entire library. "Enough coaching from the cheap seats. Elena, come to us directly. Let us show you what we're really capable of. Let us show you the story we've written about your future." Every light in the library went out simultaneously, plunging me into absolute darkness. But instead of the expected silence, I heard the sound of hundreds of books opening at once, pages flipping rapidly, as if every volume in the building was searching for a specific passage. Then, impossibly, the books began to read themselves aloud. A cacophony of voices filled the air, some familiar, some strange, all reciting different parts of what seemed to be the same story. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized that each book was glowing faintly, providing just enough light to see the chaos around me. Books were floating off their shelves, hovering in the air while their pages turned on their own. The voices were telling my story, but not the story I remembered living. In their version, I was a willing participant from the beginning, someone who had sought out this supernatural activity rather than stumbled into it. They were literally rewriting my personal history, turning me from an innocent victim into a collaborator. "Stop," I shouted, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. Elena Vasquez came to Millbrook specifically seeking the supernatural. The books chanted in unison. She researched the library's haunted reputation for months before applying for the night shift position. She has always been fascinated by the darker aspects of storytelling, drawn to narratives that blur the line between fiction and reality. I knew with horrible certainty that if they finished reciting this revised version of my story, it would become true. Reality itself would reshape around their narrative, and I would become the person they were describing, someone who had chosen this fate rather than had it thrust upon her, fighting against the supernatural wind that now whipped through the library, sending loose papers spiraling through the air. I made my way toward the basement door. The key was where Mrs. Henley had said it would be, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall near the archive entrance. The door opened with a groan that sounded almost like a living thing in pain. Below, stone steps led down into darkness that seemed thicker than normal shadow, darkness that resisted my flashlight beam as if it were a physical substance. "Don't go down there," the woman's voice called after me, now sounding desperate. "We can't protect you in the basement. That's their domain." "I have to," I called back. "It's the only way to stop them from rewriting everyone's story." The stone steps were worn smooth by decades of use, and they seemed to descend much farther than the building's foundation should have allowed. As I went deeper, the voices from above grew muted, replaced by a different kind of sound, the whisper of pages turning, but slower, more deliberate, as if someone was carefully searching through a massive book. The basement archive was larger than I'd expected, stretching far beyond what seemed possible given the library's footprint above. Ancient wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with materials that looked far older than anything that should have existed in a small Ohio town. Some were bound in materials I couldn't identify. Others were loose pages tied with ribbons that might once have been silk, but now looked organic, almost like dried skin. At the center of the space sat a large wooden table, and on it were arranged the artifacts Chin's protocol had referenced, objects that still radiated a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Pottery shards inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Bone fragments arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking at them straight on. And in the center, a leather-bound book that I knew was Margaret Millbrook's original diary. As I approached the table, the darkness around me came alive with voices, not the storytellers I'd grown familiar with, but the revisers in their full power. "You cannot use our own tools against us," they hissed in unison, their voices coming from every direction at once. "We have had decades to prepare for this moment. Chin's protocol worked only because we allowed it to work, because we needed time to grow stronger. Then why are you trying to stop me?" I asked, beginning to arrange the artifacts according to Chin's detailed instructions. Their laughter filled the basement like the sound of paper being shredded. "We're not trying to stop you. We're trying to thank you. By coming here willingly, by touching these objects with your own hands, you're completing the final requirement of our escape protocol. You've become the bridge between the written world and the living world." I felt the truth of their words as my fingers touched the first artifact, a pottery shard inscribed with symbols that seemed to move on their own. Energy flowed up my arms, cold and alien, and I realized I had made a terrible mistake. The protocol hadn't been designed to stop the revisers. It had been designed to give them exactly what they needed, a living person willing to serve as their anchor in the physical world. Chin knew. I whispered, understanding flooding through me. He knew the protocol was really a summoning ritual. Of course he knew. The voices confirmed. Chin was working with us from the beginning. His inability to read after the ritual wasn't a side effect. It was a reward. We freed him from the burden of distinguishing between fiction and reality by removing his ability to process written narrative entirely. The artifacts on the table began to glow with the same phosphorescent light I'd seen in the books upstairs. Margaret Millbrook's diary opened on its own, pages flipping to reveal text that definitely hadn't been there a century ago. Final entry, Elena Vasquez, October 31st, 2023. I understand now that some stories are meant to be lived rather than read. Tonight, I choose to become a character in a narrative far grander than anything the living world could offer. I go willingly into the unread chapters, knowing that my story will continue in ways I cannot yet imagine. No, I said, backing away from the table. I'm not writing that. That's not my choice. But it is your handwriting, the voices replied smugly. Look closer. I looked at the page again, and my blood turned to ice. The text was written in my handwriting, in ink that still looked wet despite being dated from the previous night, a night I'd spent entirely upstairs, never entering the basement at all. They had been writing my story without me, preparing for this moment, crafting the narrative that would transform me from author of my own life into a character in theirs. And now, by touching the artifacts, I'd activated the final phase of their plan. The basement around me began to change. The stone walls flickered like pages being turned, showing glimpses of different places, different times. I saw the original Shawnee burial ground, the Millbrook family home, as supernatural activity consumed their lives, the library under construction in 1923, and dozens of other scenes from the building's dark history. Welcome to the unread chapters, Elena, the voices said, now sounding like they were speaking from inside my own head. You'll find existence as a character much more interesting than your previous life as merely human. You'll be part of every story we tell, every life we influence, every person we claim. Immortality through narrative. Isn't that what every storyteller dreams of? But as the transformation began, as I felt my consciousness being pulled into their collective story, I heard a new voice, not the familiar whispers of the storytellers, but something else entirely. Elena. It was my own voice, but speaking words I hadn't said. Remember what the storytellers really told you. Remember the difference between being read and being heard. In that moment, I understood the true nature of the choice before me. The revisers wanted to be read, to have their stories experienced passively by victims who had no power to change the narrative. But the storytellers wanted to be heard, to have their experiences acknowledged, understood, and then allowed to rest. And I realized that Margaret Millbrook's diary wasn't just a prop in the reviser's ritual. It was also the key to understanding what the storytellers had been trying to tell me all along. Fighting against the supernatural energy that was trying to transform me into a fictional character. I grabbed the diary and began to read aloud. Not the false entries the revisers had written, but Margaret's actual words from 1894. The voices in the walls grow stronger each night, but I have learned to distinguish between those who seek to help and those who seek to harm. The gentle whispers come from those who died in peace, who only wish their stories to be remembered so they can finally rest. But the angry voices, the ones that demand to be obeyed rather than simply heard, these come from something else entirely. Stories that were never meant to exist. Narratives born from violence and trauma that refuse to accept their own ending. As I read her actual words, the false entries began to fade from the pages. The artifacts on the table stopped glowing, their supernatural energy disrupted by the power of truth being spoken aloud. Margaret found the answer. I continued reading, my voice growing stronger as the reviser's hold on me weakened. The way to stop the angry stories is not to fight them, but to give them what they truly want, an ending. They have been trapped in an eternal middle chapter, forever building toward a climax that never comes. By reading their story to its conclusion, by acknowledging their pain while refusing to let them perpetuate it, one can finally allow them to rest. The revisers' voices rose to a shriek of rage and frustration. You cannot end our story. We're the authors here. No, I said, turning to the final pages of Margaret's true diary. You're not the authors. You're the antagonists. And every story, no matter how dark, has to end eventually. I read Margaret's final entry, written on the night her family died. I understand now that Thomas and I were never the heroes of this tale. We were simply the ones who disturbed something that should have been left alone. The burial ground held stories of people who died in pain, and that pain transformed their memories into something hungry and endless. But pain, no matter how great, is still just a chapter in a larger story. Tonight, I choose to write the ending. May whoever reads this understand that some stories can only end with forgiveness. Forgiveness for those who cause harm, forgiveness for those who suffered it, and most importantly, forgiveness for ourselves when we fail to distinguish between justice and revenge. As I spoke the final word, everything changed. The basement filled with light, not the harsh fluorescence of the library above, but the soft, warm glow of sunrise. The artifacts on the table crumbled to dust, finally released from their supernatural preservation. And the voices changed too. The angry screaming of the revisers faded to whispers, then to sighs, then to nothing. They were finally experiencing their own ending, the conclusion they'd been denied for over a century. But the storytellers' voices grew stronger, clearer. Thank you, Elena. We can rest now. The angry stories have been given their ending, and we are free to move on to whatever comes after the final page. Will the library be safe now? I asked. The library will always hold stories, the woman's voice replied, now sounding peaceful, distant. But they will be normal stories again, books that stay on shelves, whispers that are just the building settling, shadows that behave according to natural laws. You've broken the cycle that trapped us all here. As I climbed the stairs back to the main library, I found that everything had returned to normal. Books sat properly on their shelves, computers hummed quietly in standby mode, and the fluorescent lights cast their familiar, boring illumination over reading tables and circulation desk. The only sign of the night's supernatural activity was a single note, written in handwriting I recognized as Margaret Millbrook's, sitting on the main desk. Some stories are meant to be read, others are meant to be heard. The wisdom lies in knowing the difference. Thank you for listening when others would only consume. The unread chapters have finally found their proper ending. Mrs. Henley found me there at dawn, sitting peacefully at the circulation desk and writing my final logbook entry. She looked around the library, noting the complete absence of supernatural energy that had plagued the building for decades. "It's over," she asked. "It's over," I confirmed. The angry stories have found their ending. The gentle stories have found their rest. And the library can go back to being just a library. And you? Will you stay on as night security? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I think my story with Millbrook Public Library has reached its natural conclusion too. Time to start a new chapter somewhere else. As I walked out into the morning sunshine, I realized that the real horror hadn't been the supernatural entities or the violation of natural laws. It had been the idea of being trapped in someone else's story, of losing the power to write my own narrative. But every story, no matter how dark, eventually finds its ending. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to write that ending yourself. The unread chapters of Millbrook Public Library were finally closed. But somewhere out there, new stories were waiting to be written, and I intended to make sure my next one had a much happier plot. After all, the best stories are the ones where the character remembers they're also the author.